President Trump delivered his 2026 State of the Union address in front of a joint session of Congress Tuesday night. The president focused on the economy in his first year back in office and laid out the Republican agenda heading into the midterm elections. CBS's Erica Brown has the latest from the Capitol.
Speaker, the President of the United States.
President Trump arrived in the House chamber of the Capitol to largely thunderous applause. And he highlighted the country's 250th birthday, defended his record, and laid out his agenda with a focus on the economy.
Inflation is plummeting. Incomes are rising fast. The roaring economy is roaring like never before. The price of eggs is down 60%. The cost of chicken, butter, fruit, hotels, automobiles, rent is lower today than when I took office by a lot.
But while the president touts his economic policies, a new CBS News poll shows 61% of those surveyed disapprove of his handling of the economy, and only 37% say the economy is in good condition. The president also discussed his nationwide crackdown on crime, pointing to a significant decline in murder rates.
This is the biggest decline, think of it, in recorded history, the lowest number in over 125 years.
And on his policy abroad, the president issued a stern warning to Iran as he weighs potential military action over its nuclear program.
One thing is certain, I will never allow the world's #1 sponsor of terror, which they are by far, to have a nuclear weapon. Can't let that happen.
Dozens of Democratic lawmakers boycotted the president's address, with some holding a counter program on the National Mall. Among President Trump's guests was Erica Kirk, the widow of conservative activist Charlie Kirk, and members of the U.S. men's hockey team who won the gold medal during the Winter Olympic Games. Erica Brown, CBS News, Capitol Hill.
Virginia's Governor Abigail Spanberger delivered the Democratic response to Trump's State of the Union speech. In her message, it surrounded affordability of life, highlighting the response from President Trump after the Supreme Court struck down his tariff policy. Spanberger also highlighted Trump's administrative aggression towards immigration enforcement. Throughout her speech, Spanberger posed the question of whether President Trump was working for the American voter.